we're complete. Welcome. Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining. I would like to warmly welcome you to FNF's Fringe meeting on counterbalancing Chinese resource supply, the EU's way out of dependency. My name is Fabian, I am European Affairs Manager at FNF's Brussels office. I also have a background in Chinese studies, so obviously this is something that is very close to my own heart, and FNF has been doing projects on this topic since last year. We are talking about resource dependency today. Everybody now knows that this is a very serious issue that will be continuing for the next decades to come. We will discuss various aspects of this topic, but of course the goal is not just to understand the root causes but also move forward. So we want to talk about European resilience economically and geopolitically, but we also, as liberals, we also always look at the links to what we value as a free world and also how we implement that through long-term partnerships that help us to grow together. We don't want a divided world, we want a world that is integrated, that functions well, and that is also a world that is a habitable place to live in, and where we can enjoy the freedoms that we build together. So we also think that Europe is going to be measured increasingly by the standards it manages to hold and to help improve in this regard with long-term partners that we already have, but also with new partners. And we want to hold these standards not only for ourselves, but also globally. So this is something very big, and we want to keep talking about this for as long and as much as we can. Well, I will introduce our panel now. First and above all, we have MEP Samira Rafaela, who's on the Inter Committee, so we're looking forward to hearing from you, especially about new resource partnerships from the perspective of the European Parliament, and of course also in the future of EU trade relations. So thank you so much for joining us today. Remotely, we have Wouter Hgyoot, who represents Umicore in Brussels. So it's a business that specializes in material technology, and he will give us insights into the business view on resilience, and also he will give us a background view on actually the real possibilities of technological solutions and how far that can take us. And last but not least on the panel, we have my dear colleague Fungisai, who heads our FNF office in Zimbabwe, who will bring in an African perspective, which is especially relevant for the EU's new partnerships and ways ahead on the resilience topic. And we also have my dear colleague Max from FNF's Liberal Institute in Berlin. It's our very own think tank. He's working on the economy and the environment, and he will guide us through the discussion today. Thank you all so much for joining our panel. I will hand over to you now, Max. I have a signature list here, which I will circulate. Please all leave us a signature. It's very important for us. And without further ado, let's get the discussion started.
Yeah, thank you so much for your attention. Great pleasure to be here today. And yeah, I want to start by basically introducing into the question, into the topics at charge. And I would afterwards try to look for possible solutions, and I think this is how we will structure this panel. Of course, questions by the audience will be more than welcome at this point that I will signal during the debate. Right, I hope everybody can hear me loud and clear. You as well, Wouter, you can hear me? Perfect, that is very great to hear. Right, so let's maybe go into the focus area first of all, because as we see, more than 60% of critical resources that we use in Europe and will be continuing to use into the future even more are currently sourced from China. For our case in Germany, it's actually 70 to 95% depending on the resource that you're looking at. So we see there's a huge dependency, and this dependency will become increasingly important as we turn towards more sustainable and high-tech and green tech technologies in the future. Thus, Wouter, for you, I think this is a very important aspect as you're a company Umicore is at the very fringe of this and is, of course, very invested in this whole question of getting resources to where they are needed. Thus, as we see currently all those trends towards automation on one hand and green tech on the other hand, how can you as a company, or how do you as a company react on these rising demands for resources along the value chain?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm happy to be here with you, although remotely, still somewhere in the room there. Maybe first a few words on myself and the company. So I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs. Have been in various positions in the company since 2000. And Umicore is a company that was originally named differently, Umicore. That's a long time ago, but that was resulting from activities we had in mining. We had this strategic makeover, let's say, where we decided end of the 90s to step out of mining and focus on the transformation of metals into materials. And that is what we do. We are a circular materials technology company. We transform materials into solutions. Most of our work is business to business, of course, and our customers transform that into a final product. There's three main areas that we are involved in. It is the catalyst business, where we transform precious metals, for instance, into various types of catalysts. That includes emission control catalysts for the automotive, where we are one of the major suppliers in the world, with many different types of catalysts that go to different types of industries, chemical industries and others. Second big part of our activities is recycling. We are one of the world's largest precious metals recycler. We recycle precious metals up to the purest degree from very complex materials, electronic waste, spent catalysts, which are very complex products in the end, that we manufacture, that we use in our smartphones, laptops, etc., and end of life gets recycled. And then third line of activities, and I'm going to focus a bit more on that in terms of the resources, is the battery materials business. So Umicore is a major manufacturer of the cathode active materials, which are the most valuable compound that go into rechargeable batteries, originally for laptops and mobile phones, today of course for the electrification of the automotive. And we are in the full value chain there in terms of we source materials that contain the metals that we need, and we transform them by refining, by transforming them into what we call precursor, that then goes into the final product, which is this active material, a powder that goes into the battery. So our customer is the battery manufacturer, but we are the ones that supply them with the materials to make the magic happen in the battery. Umicore is globally, we are headquartered in Brussels, about 12,000 people, half of them in Europe, and then half of them, let's say, spread over mainly Asia and the North Americas. So to answer your question on the resources, our business model is closing the loop. So in the end, and there's a lot of discussions these days on, especially in the battery value chain, the ambitions Europe has. We are part of that ambition to build a battery value chain in Europe. We are currently the only company that has the different steps represented in Europe. We do refining in Europe. We have a plant in Kokkola. We do the cathode active material production in Poland. And we have a battery recycling facility in Antwerp, in Belgium. And we plan in 3 years from here to have a much bigger, 20 times bigger recycling facility in Europe. Why do I mention that? Because that's the model we have, and I think that's where we see the future. The challenge for us, especially in Europe, is that we need a lot of materials. We need a lot of materials to go into this battery value chain. And whether or not we transform it in Europe, electrification of the automotive requires a lot of materials. They're spread around the globe. Europe does not have a lot of access to mining, primary metals, as we call it. There is possibilities for lithium, but they are limited. So the model that Umicore has is actually the one that I think we have to strive for, is the circularity. It's closing the loop. Of course, today we have to fill the pipeline with materials, but in the end, by closing the loop, we can keep these materials in. But that will only happen by 2040, we believe. So at the interim, we have to live with the fact that we will source. Yes, we can do more than in Europe, but we'll also have to source from different regions in the world the materials we need.
I think this is a very important and very interesting point you're pointing out there, since we need to build up this resilience in the long term. However, we're still in the here and now, right now. And I think, Samira, you, from a very, well, we have seen now the European perspective to many of these questions. And as you are at the very fringe of all these problems, and also at where we can actually take the decisions to do this, well, as you see here, we are all support, or I hope most of us are in support of Ukraine now, but how have we come here? We have seen that a war of aggression and this conflict of systems is very, very real in these times. And thus, I think we have to switch towards a more resilient approach. And we see that the German perspective or the European perspective is shifting towards this as well. However, do you feel, Samira, that apart from the perspective, there's also the action behind this change in perspective? So are we actually changing our approach towards China and in these new times of system conflict?
Yes, of course, and thank you for organizing this very important and timely topic, of course, because we are in a situation where obviously the geopolitical situation is changing and it's demanding a different state of play, it's demanding a different approach from Europe, obviously. I remembered one of my first interesting files in the European Parliament from the INTA perspective, the international trade perspective, was, for example, the investment agreement with China. So at a certain point, a majority in the European Parliament was in favor of freezing this investment agreement, so to not put it on the agenda for further ratification and further decision making, because we are struggling here with a country, and some of us even call China a systemic rival, that do not uphold the same values that we would like to uphold so much. And we are now in a transformation of trade. So we would like to transform into value-based and rules-based trade because we would like to be a credible partner in the world. And Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine made Europe realize that we are too dependent on certain countries, and that brings a lot of risks. So obviously we have been working in the EU on strategies to make sure that these dependencies cannot be weaponized against us, and that's what we could see with the energy crisis, and that is why the EU is building on strategies right now through, for example, the Critical Raw Materials Act, to make sure that we are more independent, but that we also have a strong, open and strategic autonomy. We speak a lot about the open strategic autonomy, but we really need to be it also. And it first starts with the diversification of our supply chains, for example. It also means that through new trade agreements that we are modernizing right now, with like-minded partners, we can strengthen also the independency from countries like China. So we are working on dedicated chapters on trade and sustainability in new modernized trade agreements. And I'm also the rapporteur on the trade agreement with Chile, and we expect it to be very important for the transition, the energy transition that we need so much because of the access to lithium that Chile can give us, for example. So we are working strongly on the dependencies on China, but we are doing that through different legislation. So take, for example, anti-coercion, take, for example, the Critical Raw Material Act, but also the forced labor ban. So I'm now the lead negotiator in the European Parliament on this new law that we are producing. We are expecting that also the forced labor ban proposal will make sure that we know where products are coming from, that we diversify, that we not only diversify the supply chains, but that we also make them ethically responsible. And that will obviously hit China. I mean, these proposals are not specifically made for China, but they were definitely a contributing factor. And we are trying to take away, for example, through the forced labor ban, we are trying to take away the economic incentive to keep working with forced labor and to then continue with human rights violations. So yes, these are examples of the EU becoming more resilient, but also promoting more values in the world through new legislation, and we are obviously building on more and stronger relationships with like-minded countries in other parts of the world. Take, for example, Latin America, but the African continent is also extremely important there, where we see China taking a lot of ground.
Well, you're making this really easy for me. So, of course, also, Wouter, I really like your comment on changing from materials to products, basically. So seeing this whole value chain, and this is something that we see in Africa as well, actually. If you look at the last 10 to 15 years, mainly Chinese investors have been heavily invested in Africa, and something that I personally found very interesting is that they're not only trying to mine it there, but actually they're also building up smelting and refinery infrastructure. So they're actually producing more of the value chain there, thus their investment is not only, they are there to stay, and that's not just for short-term investment. So, however, of course, there are also side effects to this. So, I wanted to include this African perspective here, and I wanted to ask you in this regard, what are the effects that you guys are feeling, both towards your communities and society, but also with regards to environmental effects right there down on the ground? So what are the effects of these Chinese investments?
Thank you very much, Max, and good morning to everyone. Yes, China is in Africa, and I have to say this in the context that yesterday we celebrated Africa Day, and we celebrated Africa Day, and this marks 60 years, you know, of the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which at the time when it was formed, it was there to actually fight colonialism, protect Africa against colonialism. But it evolved, and around 2002 it changed to African Union, because its thrust then was on ensuring its independence, its territorial sovereignty. So I'm saying this in the context that whilst Africa has been on that trajectory, we have also realized that we have remained a victim also of the abundance of the resources that Africa has. And China has made Africa relive also the colonial experiences. China has come in, and its claws are everywhere. Talk of mining, talk of agriculture, talk of everything, even building parliaments, they are everywhere. I'll give you an example that, for example, in the DRC, which actually produces 70% of the cobalt which the world uses, you know, out of the 19, you know, cobalt producing companies, 15 of them are dominated by China. You come to Zimbabwe, where I come from. Zimbabwe is actually the largest, it has the largest reserves of lithium in the whole of Africa. And China has penetrated the Great Dyke. The Great Dyke is the mineral belt that cuts across Zimbabwe from one end to the other end. And what do? It's a sorry sight for us. The environmental degradation is serious. They leave just the open pits, and our own people in the rural communities cannot survive. You know, there are actually areas where you can't grow any crops anymore, or areas where no animal or whatever, any cattle can survive because of the mining practices, the methods that they have used, that actually continue to portray a complete disregard of us as an African people, a complete disregard of our own livelihood. And this is China for us. But they are making billions. But what has it done for us? Our poverty has increased. In Zimbabwe, as we speak, close to 50% of Zimbabweans are in extreme poverty. What kind of an investment is this? Which does not even help us grow in any way, which takes away everything, and we're actually going steps back. Yet an investment, if I understand correctly, is supposed to help us take the baby steps towards our economic freedom as a nation. And you would assume that because they have all the support, they are in close linkages, they enjoy actually serious military and political ties in Africa. Hence their immunity, their impunity whenever they do wrong. They are in running battles with the locals because the locals feel shortchanged. Chinese have no interest in economic rights for our people. China has no interest in our environmental rights of our people. China is for China. And that is where we are. And for Europe now, Europe has come in and said, you have rights. Your rights need to be defended. But my concern, Max, is Europe is also under pressure to now shift and emulate China. And when you shift because China's model, you think there are visible projects, there are visible infrastructure developments which they are willing to flout to everybody who cares to listen. Are you going to be able to do it? Are you able to compete with China in that ruthlessness? Europe needs to self-introspect and ask itself, what are we good at? Will you be able to really work with authoritarian regimes in the true sense of them? Will you be able to run businesses and serious investments in an environment where corruption is manifest? It is the order of the day. Are you sure you do not want a rule-based system? Maybe it's what you need to think of as we continue to carry the burden of China as Africa. And I'll be honest with you, I know that there's a belief that Africa wants China. No, Africa wants both. And it wants a space where it is also recognized as a player. Thank you.
Well, very tough one to follow. So, I mean, now we have discussed what we don't want about China, but what opportunities do you see for the global West or the European Union more in specific in terms of how could we stage or better yet, produce real partnerships with you guys that can lead to something that is in our mutual benefit?
I'll be quick to say that Africa, yes, wants partnership. And the partnership that is there with China at the moment, it is a partnership that is exploitative, it is a partnership that is extractive. Yes, China could appear to be winning at the moment, but I'll remind you that history has shown us that whenever we treat people like that, eventually one day, something is going to give. And I feel that we'll head that direction. And so, I would actually think of partnership with that one is not only obsessed with the political elite when you engage in Africa. For example, if you look at how the EU and the US and Zimbabwe at the moment, in their efforts actually to counter and outshine China, they are trying to invest more in their ties with the government at the expense of more ties with the private sector itself. I don't remember the last time I saw an EU delegation, business delegation in Zimbabwe, coming to really assess the situation and see what the opportunities are. But I've seen them well with the government, with everybody else. And the problem then with that approach is that, especially in our democracies, which have no guarantees of how things will evolve eventually, when the political elite fall, everything then tumbles. So I urge Europe to look at a partnership that also really brings the private sector in the center, because that could be a critical funnel for actually pushing for some of the values that Europe holds dear. And I also think that Europe should also continue in its partnership with the citizens of Africa, the ordinary people who suffer, who face all the consequences, whatever investment takes, whatever form the investment takes. It is important to make sure that they are considered, they are regarded, and also just some of their values are also respected. For example, with China, the current arrangement is they will come and displace people in our communities, and no compensation whatsoever. So you can imagine the pain, because they just want to open their mining plant there, the pain that our people have to go through with that. That is not partnership. A partnership should also seek to engage the ordinary people, especially the ones where you seek to benefit from. And I think that model could also help us in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those comments. I think in this liberal community, we might have many questions from the audience, so please I would be very happy to take one or two questions now before we get into the solution part of this discussion. Yes, please. Maybe just speak loudly, because otherwise, or maybe, yeah, that would be great. Yeah, danke, Jede.
Sven Boss.
Okay.
Sven Boss from FDP Germany. If you're talking about Africa, I was questioning, how would you, if you can, be able to distinguish Africa as to the respect of the arguments you just brought? Let's say Europeans tend to stereotype, and I would like to make it simpler for those. Maybe you can give a few words on which countries of Africa are, let's say, more adaptive to this, which aren't. Some countries are known, but maybe it's not about the name of the country, but more about the structures. You mentioned corruption as one of the driving factors. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what you talk about when you say Africa?
Well, that's a difficult one, really. But I would agree with you that Africa itself, whilst it is a homogeneous geographic continent, it is also very diverse in its dealings either with the West and also even with China or Russia. And you find, I think most of you are already aware, that it is easier for China to work in authoritarian regimes. It will not look at corruption in Zimbabwe, it is not interested in that. It will not look at all the human rights violations in those sectors, it is not interested in that. Its focus is its economic interests. So authoritarian regimes like Zimbabwe, like Lesotho, you see the Chinese have a very strong hand in there. And there are some instances where, at least in countries where there is a semblance of democracy, at least, you can see even if they are there, at least they are a bit controlled. You find South Africa also has a strong Chinese presence there. But the fact that they also have some semblance of democracy that can hold, or at least attempt to hold its leaders into account, makes Chinese penetration not as simple or as is the case in Zimbabwe. And so that is where my real contribution is on. Yes, we feel that maybe the democracy, pushing for the democracy agenda has not yielded the results that we want. But there are pockets in Africa, and the mapping, I think that's what you need to look at. Where do you think really this could work, where the values, the Western values would quickly resonate, with certain African countries. And there are some where it won't. And there's also an emerging group of Africans who are quick to say, whenever you raise an issue, they'll say, who are you to tell me this? Who are you? What position are you in to really be telling me this? I'll give you an example of Uganda. Uganda, remember there's been a debate around the LGBTIQ community. And I think there was a tweet, is it from the former president of the US, Obama, actually, admonishing Uganda over this. And the next day, what did Uganda do? Just a few days later, it passed the law against the LGBTIQ in Uganda. So, megaphone diplomacy works in certain instances. But there are instances where you have to really wait and see, do we really need to raise our voice here, or it's not necessary? What are the priority values for these particular countries where we really feel that these are the values that are non-negotiable at the very least, and on this one, we can negotiate and relax on these ones. So Africa is very diverse, its interests are very diverse, and never attempt to treat them as one homogeneous group. You will be disappointed.
Well, thank you so much. I think we will have to push the questions at the end now, because, I mean, this is, of course, there's a lot to talk about. I think we could just keep on for the whole day now, but I think we have to keep it a bit short now. Now, after mapping out the problem, I think we should maybe talk about possible solutions. And what you just talked about was this investment not only economically but also in the institutions of Africa, Chinese investment in the institutions of Africa in order to, well, let's say, bad voices would say manipulate, but maybe you would say just to incentivize in one way or another. And Samira, I feel that we are in a situation, obviously in Europe, where this is not half as bad, but where we also see Chinese actors actively, and I'm really meaning actively, trying to give impulses into the European and national debates of the member countries. Thus, wouldn't you say that this might be or prove to be disadvantages in the long term in our aim of achieving higher degrees of economic and political sovereignty?
Yes, I mean, that's something we know. Look, what I find very important is that the EU is going to do introspection here. So we need to look to our own position in the world critically and see where we can strengthen the relationships we have with like-minded partners or with parts of the world where we do not have such strong relationship yet. And we need to look at it strategically, and we will always remain open, but at the same time we also need to see where we would like to draw some more lines here with China, for example. So we know that we are lagging behind in the world when it comes to many countries in the world that we would like to be the #1 trade partner, for example. We find ourselves often behind China or the US, which is, I think, fine, but when we are behind China, we need to think twice and see what we can really improve there. And that's not only for the African continent, that's also for the Latin America continent, for example, but it does take two ways. So it needs to be a relationship that is equal and that is also wanted from the other side. And therefore, the EU delegations and the missions, for example, that we do from the Parliament side are very important. We recently visited South Africa, but also Kenya. I've even been to Ethiopia. We also visit Latin America. So these kind of exchanges are very important to show these countries like, hey, we really want to have a serious strategic, economic relationship with you. But we do need to be more proactive in that, and it's good to see that, for example, also to deal with the foreign investment incentives coming from China, for example. We have the Global Gateway that is now announced and proposed by the European Commission. That is like a major investment that's going to happen in Latin America and the African continent. So you'll find a lot of projects and investments on infrastructure, for example, but also on climate and the green transition. And that will hopefully have a significant importance for the future relationship that we are trying to develop with these continents. So, yeah, we first of all need to start with our own economic and political sovereignty, and we have now, for example, also the anti-coercion instrument in place that needs to trigger the EU response, basically, to the foreign actors targeting member states. So we are working on certain legislative files to do that. But I would say just start looking at ourselves, be proactive in building the strategic relationships, and we need to continue with closing all kinds of economic partnership agreements. So we expect, for example, with Kenya, good news, expected. We also expect for post-Cotonou, hopefully soon, good news, the post-Cotonou agreement. That is a major agreement with countries in the Pacific, but also the Caribbean and Africa, and then the European Union. And we have interesting integrations going on, so in terms of economic integration in the African continent, for example, the ECOWAS, we have the AFCFTA that we are trying to develop, and this is where we need to jump in and see where we can give the technical assistance and support so that we are building on a different kind of dependency. And at the same time, I'm like, yeah, we need to stand for the values that we have so much, and I think the EU is a very reliable, credible, attractive partner to do trade with or to have an economic relationship with or a strategic relationship, because we can not only say human rights, but we also have the best practices in place, we have the knowledge in place when it comes to climate standards, for example. So yeah, I think in a way it is fair enough to say, look, these are still our values. We will not back down from it, but we can definitely have the conversation on how we can help to develop other partner countries to come at the same level or to come at the same standard. So I would like to see a more grown up relationship instead of always talking about each other as if, you know, one of them is less worth or the other one feels more smaller. Yeah, it's time to have serious growing up strategic relationships with these parts of the world. Yeah, and that would be part of the solution.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. I think that's why it's very important that we have Fungi here with us today, also to talk with each other instead of talking about each other, which is simply, apart from the neocolonial touch to it, it's very important to have the aspects and those ideas from the regions that we're talking with on the table as well. However, I think your point about standards, especially in terms of climate and environmental standards, is very important also to you, Wouter, since your company is trying not only to source more domestically from what I understood, but also very intensively works on higher recycling rates and works towards the circular economy. Thus, how can you see that these strategies will work out in the ever increasing demand that we're also facing, especially if we talk about the new trade agreements that we're trying to work out with our partners in other regions of the world, and in the light of our approaches towards sector coupling and e-mobility?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, and a very rich conversation, very inspiring for a company that is globally active. We do have our own facilities and joint ventures in China as well, including refining, so we know what we speak about. We source a lot of cobalt from Congo. Mother Nature has put 65–70% of cobalt in Congo, so there are other areas in the world that also supply it, but Congo and cobalt are intimately linked, just like nickel and Indonesia, we didn't mention that, or lithium and Australia and Latin America are very much linked. Now to your question, look, from a European perspective, Europe has a great plan in place. It's the Green Deal plan. Regrettably, I would say it's not yet an industrial plan. As a company, we value a lot the principles that we stand for in Europe. The Critical Raw Materials Act has a clear ambition in terms of what we want to do ourselves in Europe. It has this notice of partnerships that Samira referred to. That's all great. But on the other hand, we are an open market. Yes, we have some free trade agreements which then avoid the import duties, as an example. But we're an open market. And if you want to talk about China and open market, what we face is that there's also costs to the way we do things, which we stand for. It's enshrined in our sustainability approach and its responsibility and sustainability, but there's also a cost that comes through that. And that is not currently required. We are very much for a regional by regional approach. We find it great that there's an Inflation Reduction Act in the US because finally they have a plan for decarbonization. You can call it inflation reduction or other things, but it's a climate plan as well. So they've got a plan. But the thing is that they're very clear. They're very clear in also how they're going to avoid materials and their products that come from foreign entities of concern, reach China. They're super clear on that. Europe is not. We are, for our principles, we have great Green Deal, Critical Raw Materials Act, Sustainability, Due Diligence Directive, Forced Labor, all of that is good. We stand for that. But then we manufacture products and we let the door open for products that, for instance, come from China. I mean, Chinese EVs are being massively produced at a much lower cost base than we have in Europe, and they're imported into Europe. Recently, in our battery value chain, you know that Europe is trying to establish its own battery value chain. Great, we are part of that. But the recent announcements in France of companies investing in cathode materials activity, Chinese companies, I mean, it's an open approach we have. So, you know, the point is that, let's take it from a positive side, there are things that we can do, of course, with the implementation of the Critical Raw Materials Act, with establishing this free trade agreements, and the third-party partnerships that Europe stands for. But we also have to critically think about, okay, are we supportive enough in the end to make industrial companies that have to be profitable to survive and to invest further? Is that industrial plan also present in Europe? And to our estimation, it is not sufficiently present yet.
So, yeah, that is a very intensive concern, of course, of many other companies as well. And I think we will most likely have a question regarding that by the audience in a couple of minutes. However, I mean, we have to be realistic here as well. And as the world is turning, I think it is very important that we also face the very global strategic relevance of the changes that we're currently seeing. And does your company has a contingency plan for the case that sourcing and trade with partners or with established trading partners that we're currently working with becomes more burdensome in the future? So do you as a company work on strategies regarding this aspect?
It's all about diversification of supply. It wouldn't be wise to be married to only one supplier. I mean, single supplier situations are always to be avoided. And regardless of the fact that certain materials come from preferred regions, if I can translate it like that, because of the large availability, there's always, enshrined in the strategy is diversification of supply. And in the end, but as I said at the start, closed loop recycling is there. It's also enshrined in the approach Europe takes. But it's going to be a long while before we have sufficient materials sourced from closed loops. It exists. I'll give you the example where it does exist to a large extent. It is the automotive catalysts. The precious metals which are used there are coming to a large extent, and I talk about much larger than 50%, from recycling. Because the end-of-life catalysts are all collected, there's valuable materials inside, they can be recycled, they are recycled, and the materials go back into the loop. That is in the end also for the new technologies, not only batteries, also windmills, solar panels. In the end, that's the model that we have to embed, and then you have, that's another way of diversification of supply. But that's a long-term achievement. On the short term, it's of course look into your the various options you have and make sure you keep various open.
Yeah, in terms of diversification, of course, you can't say diversification without also looking at Africa. And as we already talked about our relevance in the realm of Africa or South America as well, how do you see that we as Germany or the European Union and the West in general could assist African partners in their strive towards a more equitable, fair, inclusive and sustainable partnership? Both, and that's very important because we don't want to be exclusive, both with regard to PRC and our countries as a European Union.
Thank you very much. I think I'll start with what also Africa needs to do. I know there is pressure now to be able to have strong economic ties with Africa. But there are basic things like respect of property rights should be non-negotiable. Because the problem is the moment you get in there with a group of people who have, you know what, for those that have followed the Zimbabwean story would agree with me what happened with the land reform exercise. We can change overnight and the whole thing can turn into a mess. So property rights, do not ever feel bad about asking for them and making sure that the measures are clear on how Africa intends to protect the property rights. Because this we are seeing a trend, a significant trend, where we are shifting away from that respect. Because we can see that the Chinese are not bothered with that. They are quick to want to get things done and to get moving quickly. And I think they know also that this is temporary. That is why maybe they take that model. And I also feel that there are certain levels of corruption that I think also you would not want to associate with. And those demands, I do not think it's unfair to continuously insist on Africa also to try and make sure that it has clear systems that will protect also the investments that you'll be trying to bring along. Because the moment you also let that go again, you know, the brazen corruption that is taking place at the moment, actually the whole investment could amount to an exercise in futility. So Africa needs to sort out the issues around corruption. There are countries that are doing much better in that regard, but you know, there are some like Zimbabwe that are really worse, and when we are getting in there, you need to make sure that at least the assurances in that regard are very clear. Africa needs to work on its democracy. I know that because the economic interests are putting people under pressure, you then feel that the whole democratic push is not necessary anymore. But I don't know if I can take a detour a bit and say, you know what is going to bring China down is China. That's what is going to bring down China. Why? Yes, Xi at the moment is the greatest thing in China, but is there any clear succession system that is there? That is where democracy comes in. That is what you want when you are dealing with Africa. There should be a clear system that if this president is no longer there, we still are able to carry on with our relationships and with our business. But if you then allow a totally authoritarian system that has no respect of democratic values in any way, because you are so desperate to be able to gain the economic access, I think that could be really a volatile, approach to tack. So we need to continue strengthening the democratic processes and institutions in Africa. That is the only way also we can strengthen our economic ties as well. China understands that. That is why they've decided to start building the parliaments in Africa. You go to Lesotho, there is parliament. You go to Malawi, you come to Zimbabwe, there are these huge buildings there. Why are they doing that also? They understand that they need to be in spaces where the political dynamics happen. And they need to have a close eye on them. And that's why I believe that they have taken parliament buildings as a key area of their investment. I don't think they really care much about us growing as democracies, but they want an avenue to gain access, whether you are opposition, whether you are the ruling party, whether you are something, they need to be occupying that space. I know there is lethargy around African politics in certain sectors, but China is going the opposite direction. I know you would follow the Julius Nyerere Leadership School in Tanzania, where China is working with all the liberation movements in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Working with young people in those parties, already hitting way ahead in making sure that they sustain Chinese influence. So we should not give up on working with the clear political actors who can also help uphold the values that we seek to achieve in the world. And I've already highlighted that the EU cannot be China. it will not manage to be China. You know, you can strive and try, but you want your accountability, you want your transparency, and the Chinese model will simply not be the effective one for you. So the EU needs to go back. What are we best at? And this is what we need to do. What holds the EU together? Because be careful, as you try to push for all these things, you can destroy the EU itself. And once you destroy the EU, China is strong as well in that regard. So Africa needs an investment model of the equals, as she says. They want also to feel, because remember they are coming from a history of serious insecurities themselves. So they are bound to treat everybody coming in with suspicion and everything else. But assurances also around trust, around respect, and that they are equal players, as partners as it were, could also help in terms of how we engage with them. And I also highlighted that the megaphone diplomacy here and there, at times we have to look at what exactly do we want to gain from this relationship, as it were. Africa needs EU. Yes, it works with China. Look at how many people are migrating to the EU. Have you heard of us going to China? We still, even when we see them back home in large numbers, China is still not attractive to us. The model is not attractive to the ordinary Zimbabwean. It might be attractive to our political elites, but remember, a country is its people. And if the people do not find the model attractive, then it is not worth it. Yes, they have all the billions, and maybe you feel they are lagging behind in terms of getting also the access to all the businesses that are happening there. But a country is its people. If the people are not happy, it will be difficult to even sustain all that. China has so many litigation costs that it's facing, even in Zimbabwe at the moment, with people raising concerns over its practices. Because remember, we now know what our rights are, and we can feel where they are being trampled. And China is doing that, and it's facing resistance. And maybe, why not also look at how we strengthen those that are picking out the faults that are in the system? Are we able to help Africa relook at its own mining policies, for example, so that at the end of the day, they can have a win-win situation? Zimbabwe is actually going through that process as well, because they realize they are overwhelmed with the minings that are happening in Zimbabwe. But what do we do? There are efforts to try and come up with legislation that can actually really also restrict the operations of the Chinese, as it were. But don't ever think that they are against the West. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this idea about the country is more defined by the people than by the government is very important for the European context as well. And I think this is a very good point for you to end this discussion, this ordered discussion now. And would you, Samira, think that this current geopolitical situation isn't a great idea, a great impulse for us as Europeans to stand ever more stronger together and build up institutions that actually progresses this European idea rather than national ideas and national concerns?
Yes, of course, and at the same time, it makes the diversity in Europe makes it so beautiful. I think in a way it's always about finding the right balance between what we bring in on a national level and what the national context of member states is, and what at the same time the collective strategy needs to be as being the EU. I mean, that makes us so strong in the world, that makes us so strategic, and we have so much leverage that we can use for closing new trade agreements, for creating better and stronger economic relationships. So I am positive in that regard, and we are now working on an assertive toolbox. We call it the assertive toolbox of trade instruments, of new legislation that fits the whole rule-based idea and vision that we have. And what we're trying to do now is that, look, getting in touch with these like-minded countries, that's the first step. But then the second step is also on a very technical level, so diversifying supply chains indeed, like Wouter is explaining, but we also need to make sure that we have multiple suppliers that we depend on, so not only from one, and that means that we need to look for it proactively and see where we can organize that in different places. I don't believe that, and it doesn't fit also the idea of being an open strategic economy, that we completely can cut off the trade or the economic relationship with a country like China. I mean, it's also a question about, do you really want that? But it's about finding the right balance here. And what we see nowadays is that we could not find the right balance. We do not have the right balance, or the dependency is just too strong. So basically what we're doing now is to bring in a new balance in the level playing field, in the international level playing field by working on the supply chains, diversifying, looking for multiple sources, creating more trade relations, creating more legislation and so on to support that idea. And what we're also specifically doing is taking away certain incentives, so economic incentives, through, for example, the forced labor ban, so that it is not attractive anymore to keep working in the same way that certain countries, like for example China, is doing. Again, I think there are a lot of opportunities for the EU to deal with the new geopolitical situation. We need to be proactive. We need to be present in the countries that we would like to see other relationships developing. Still, it is also the responsibility of these countries to keep working indeed on their own democracy, to make sure that they have the right leaders in place, the leaders that are sensitive for what the population is demanding, leaders that are willing to really have the conversation on creating equal partnerships also, and that can bring in the expertise. And I believe that it is a responsibility of Europe to do more investments, to do more trade, so that we can also help to develop the local economies of such countries, and that we can really show that we are more attractive, that we are, well, I think, the attractive partner to work with in the world, because so much opportunities are there when you speak about human capital. Take, for example, female businesses, female entrepreneurship. Take, for example, the youth. If you look at the African continent, 60% out of the population exists of youth. So that means that we can create a lot of opportunities to invest in the new generation. And also what will really help in creating more independency from countries like China is that, and that is, I believe, the positive thing of migration, while often the causes of migration are negative and very impactful and even touches upon human rights violations, is that we have a new diaspora here in Europe. Take, for example, the African diaspora, but we also have a large diaspora with having roots in Latin America and Caribbean, in the Caribbean. I'm also part of a European Afro-Caribbean diaspora that is going to the African continent, that is trying to see where we can invest, that is trying to see where we can help to develop entrepreneurship and so on. And that is very much the strength of Europe. So we have different diasporas in Europe that can help to build different kinds of relationships in the world. So we have a lot of bridge builders. And that is where we can also make sure that we use the expertise coming from these diasporas to build the right relationships in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bridge building, I think, is a very good topic here as well. Maybe we could bridge to two more questions, considering the time right now. Maybe two very short questions, one there, and maybe one female question if there is. Okay, okay, no female questions, then maybe you will have a question as well. Yeah, yeah, genau, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Reinhardt from Denmark.
Yeah.
I have actually two questions. The first question is the Global Gateway program has been going on for a while, where is the progress status visibility in some way that could be good to be able to be made available? We're talking a lot about the global gateway, but where do we see the progress? The second question is basically about...
It's one question, sorry, one question per person, otherwise we can't handle it. You had a question as well? Yeah?
I did.
Yeah.
Can I just shout it away?
Yeah, maybe just pass it, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Mention was made of working with sort of individuals and communities in Africa. How about how we work with and inform individuals and communities in Europe?
Very interesting question. So, Samira, are you going to take it?
Yes. Well, thank you for the first question. To be honest, Global Gateway is not so active yet. I mean, it's only in the beginning, in the first stage actually. So it's not that Global Gateway is already implemented for years now. I think the European Commission is only starting this year very seriously. They have already developed and created like I think 60 or 70 projects. We do not speak about thousands of euros, we speak about billions, so it's immense. So it will take, of course, some time to implement that all very well. They already analyzed and they already have the countries in place, the regions in place, where they will invest. And it also depends, of course, on the conversations and the cooperations that they will have with the governments in these countries. So it will only start actually by now. I mean, it's something that we need to wait for now and to see what the results are. Yeah. And then the second question, would you like to answer that or? All right. So if I correct you right, this is about how we are going to inform the communities and people in Europe on the possibilities.
On what happened in Africa. I think most people have no idea what's going on and look at headlines and say these countries are corrupt, and that's the reason they're poor.
Yeah, well, that's difficult, but I mean, I think we have a responsibility as being politicians and lawmakers to keep informing the communities very well and to keep informing people very well on what we're exactly doing and why we would like to do the investments and create the new kinds of relationships in the world for what kinds of reasons. I do think that the Russian aggression towards Ukraine have made a lot of European citizens aware of the dependency that we have so much. And I think, even though it is terrible what's happening, of course, that this is helping to make people realize that we really need to do it differently. Yeah, and I think here again, the diaspora can truly help to make sure that the information is there for people and can act as bridge builders there. So it's about keeping people informed and staying in touch with people. There's actually no other answer that I can think of.
Thank you so much for your answers. Thank you so much for your interest in this debate today, and have a great stay in Stockholm. Thank you so much.